Hello, everyone. This is Cory Stai, Director of Research and Partnership Development with Read Naturally, and your host for today's webinar. Thank you for joining us for Conquering Dyslexia, a conversation with Dr. Jan Hasbrouck. Before we begin, a couple of opening items. We have set aside 75 minutes for today's webinar. It will begin with Dr. Hasbrouck's presentation and be followed by a conversation during which we'll delve more deeply into the topics addressed, as well as answer some of the many questions submitted by you. You should all have received links to today's handouts in the meeting reminder email. Handouts are also readily available from the meeting panel of the webinar window if you'd like to open, download, or print them out, either now or during the presentation. Many of you have also asked about a recording of this webinar. We'll be sending out follow-up emails with links to a recording in about 24 hours, so please look for that in your inbox. Feel free to share the recording with others at your school or community who you think would benefit from this valuable information. Finally, if you're having technical difficulties, please contact GoToWebinar support. Their phone number is listed at the bottom of the meeting panel. And with that out of the way, let's get our conversation started with a quick introduction. There are few hotter topics in education today than that of dyslexia, a specific learning disability in reading that affects millions of people around the globe. To help enhance our awareness and knowledge of this topic, as well as our capacity to meet the social, emotional, and educational needs of individuals with dyslexia, I'm thrilled to introduce our teacher for the day. Dr. Jan Hasbrouck is a leading researcher, educational consultant, and author who works with schools in the United States and internationally. Dr. Hasbrouck worked as a reading specialist and coach for 15 years and later became a university professor. She is the author or co-author of several books, and her research in reading fluency, academic assessment, interventions, and instructional coaching has been widely published. Her latest book is Conquering Dyslexia, a guide to early detection and prevention for teachers and families, which came out earlier this year. A longtime trainer and collaborator with Read Naturally, we're thrilled to have her here today to impart some of her knowledge and wisdom with us on today's topic of dyslexia. So without any further delay, it's my pleasure to pass the virtual microphone off to Dr. Jan Hasbrouck, our presenter for today's webinar. Jan?
Thank you, Cory. I'm delighted to be here and welcome to everybody attending live today. It's always nice to have some folks to chat with live, and to all of you who will later be able to review this webinar today and the conversation I'm going to have later with Cory. So let's go ahead and get started on the topic of conquering dyslexia. As Cory mentioned, I have written a book. This was published last year about conquering dyslexia, and my piece today is really excerpted from this book. So if you have interest in following up or digging a little deeper, that would be the one resource for you to use. And you can see there are 5 chapters, but there is a whole section too on resources for dyslexia. And the fact that this just came out last year, I was really happy that so many of the resources and references are very, very new and very current. Writing this book was a personal journey for me. The person there on the left with the blue sweater, that's me, waving virtually hello to you. I'm standing next to my daughter, Lizzie, who is one of those many millions around the world, as Cory mentioned, a person with dyslexia. I was a reading specialist before Lizzie was born. Her brother had already come before her and had no issues around learning to read, spell, or write. It was an entirely different experience with Lizzie. I was completely unprepared as a reading specialist to do the kinds of things that she needed as a child with dyslexia. But I've walked that journey not only as a teacher, reading specialist, but also a parent, and it has certainly affected what I do. But I hope you can see from our smiling faces that the basic message that I have to share with you is, although dyslexia is an incredibly big challenge to the folks who have it and their families. It is something that we can persevere, we can succeed. Lizzie's a very successful person with college degrees and a lovely career and a very rich and productive life. So that's the message we want to share too in Conquering Dyslexia. But let's go ahead and get started with the content. Of course, we're going to spend this time talking about dyslexia, so let's go ahead and define it. I know all of you have come to this conversation today with different understandings of dyslexia. You have likely heard about the problems with reversals, B, D, P, and Q, that are often associated with dyslexia. Many children with dyslexia are understood to be reading backwards or writing backwards, mirror writing. Sometimes people talk about that. Some people with dyslexia talk about the text moving around on the page. We've heard about dyslexia as related to vision issues. Kids aren't seeing the words correctly. It must be something around the eye, that more boys than girls have dyslexia. Or perhaps you've heard that really these kids with all these problems just need to try harder. Well, what we know now in 2020 is that actually not one of these things is true. They're beliefs that have come as we were trying hard to figure out what dyslexia was, but none of them have been validated by science. There is a lot of science out there, a lot of good research. We'll touch on some of that today. I'm a big fan of Mark Seidenberg's work. Particularly his book, Language at the Speed of Sight, which is not specifically around dyslexia, it's around reading in general. But he does talk about the research, and he mentions dyslexia and says this, very pertinent to our conversation today, that defining dyslexia has been confusing because the explanations keep changing. They keep changing as the research advances. And we are so lucky in the area of dyslexia that we have a lot of research coming from two major sources. We have the medical side of research, the physical side, the neuroanatomy, neurobiology, developmental cognitive neuroscience. All of these researchers have helped us much more fully understand how the brain develops and functions, the physical nature, the organic nature of brain development. And then we have another group of researchers, and I would fit on this side, psychologists and educational researchers from cognitive psychology, educational psychology, special education, audiology and speech pathology. Those folks are looking at the function of the brain. So we have how the brain is structured and how the brain functions, and we've learned so much. One of the most valuable tools to dyslexia research has been the tools that allow us to image the brain using magnetic images, magnetic encephalography, and fMRIs, functional magnetic resonance imaging, which have been around only for a fairly short period of time. The two pictures at the top that you see, a little girl engaging in one of the very first studies to use magnetic source imaging related to dyslexia. And I love the picture because she's smiling. You can see a peek of her hair there. We didn't have to shave her head and implant electrodes. This is non-invasive ways of looking at the brain. So she's lying there reading. She has to keep extremely still, but that was an earlier version of these machines. At the bottom, you see some updated images. These come from Dr. Nadine Gabb's work, her lab that she has going at Boston Women's and Harvard University, where she is studying younger children. She's doing infant imaging studies, specifically around dyslexia of infants and toddlers. So it's fascinating. What we get from these magnetic source images are pictures like this. You may have seen some if you are learning about dyslexia research. These are scans of the brain of two 5-year-olds, two different children, both 5-year-olds who have not yet learned to read. They're both learning to read, but this is just a perfect image to demonstrate what we have learned from this kind of research. The child at the left is labeled not at risk, or the child at the right's brain is labeled at risk before they even start to read. So the not risk child is labeled not at risk because of the patterns of activation in the brain. So those red dots are stimulating blood flow that is registered or imaged by the magnets in those machines. And what we're seeing, both of these children are engaging in some kind of literacy or language-based task. Perhaps they're being asked to recite the ABCs, or they're listening to some nursery rhymes or something like that that should be stimulating the language centers of the brain, which is what's happening in the not at-risk child on the left. That linguistic activity is stimulating their left hemisphere, which is what happens in a neurotypical brain. The child on the right is doing the opposite, engaged in the same kind of literacy linguistic task. Their brain is wired in a way where they're attempting to process linguistic information or linguistic activities in the right hemisphere, which is not the hemisphere that has genetically evolved to process language. So we know already, even before this child has is learning to read formally, that they are likely going to have some difficulties, and we may go as far as to label this child dyslexic. So the International Dyslexia Association plays a large role in helping us understand dyslexia. They serve as a clearinghouse and synthesizer, if you will, of all this growing body of research. And from their work, they have come up with certain key points to counter the ones that we started with. We have learned that dyslexia is not a visual or spatial issue. We thought it was for decades. That was the prevailing theory, but the fMRI machines have really helped us understand it's not. But we've also known for many decades too that the eyes are really not essential in learning to read. We need to get some kind of symbolic representation of language into the brain. But if we teach blind children to read with Braille, they, in general, learn to read with relative ease, whereas our children who are deaf or hearing impaired universally have difficulty learning to read and may never learn to read successfully. So we've actually theorized for a while about this, but definitively we now know that dyslexia is an auditory concern. We understand that it varies in impact and intensity. You can have mild or very mild dyslexia through a moderate level, which is where my daughter and I would consider her dyslexia, to very severe dyslexia. It is genetic. You saw that from that previous image of the brains. Children are born with brains that have a dyslexic propensity. It does follow in family groups. There is at this point, and likely never will be, the genetic researchers saying there's not a dyslexia gene. There's a cluster of genes, and we don't even at this point have completely identified even what those are, but we do know that dyslexia runs in families, and it does appear to be genetic. It can, although it is an auditory issue, it can affect speaking fluency because of the left hemisphere issues around dyslexia. The way language is processed, stored, and accessed can be impaired by our readers with dyslexia. There are emotional consequences, sometimes quite severe, even with mild and moderate dyslexia, affects the confidence of children. We see so many stories, and some are shared in our book about young children who, before their attempt to learn to read, are bright and confident, and everything is going very well for them. But when they hit school around 5 to 6 years old, suddenly things that were so easy for them are no longer easy, and they're watching their peers learn to read, write, and spell so easily, and that can be quite devastating for these children. We're not sure, hence the question mark there, about the percent of the population that has dyslexia. The IDA, International Dyslexia Association, says perhaps around 15%. More people on the medical world say 7 to 10%. There is one researcher, a revered researcher, Sally Shaywitz, who has long believed and shared in she feels her research evidence says there's up to 20%, but I think most people are probably confident around 10 to 15%. So one of the handouts I shared with you is this lovely infographic labeled The Ladder of Reading, created by Nancy Young, who lives in British Columbia, Canada. Nancy has a great interest in reading and reading development, and from her reading of the reading research, she put together this ladder, which is very deeply reflects and accurately reflects our current understanding of research and the propensity or affinity of different children born into the world, of the ease with which they are going to learn to read. So we have the group at the top in that dark green bar. About 5% of children labeled by researchers as precocious readers who learn to read seemingly effortlessly. You may have had a child like that. Maybe you are someone like that. It's a mysterious group of people that are just reading is so easy for them. And then another 35% learn to read with some instruction, but the instruction can really vary, can be broad, it doesn't have to be particularly focused. So about 40% of the population across the world, not dependent on language, regardless of the language they speak, about 40% of people are going to find learning to read relatively easy. 40 to 50% will learn to read. They can learn to read proficiently, especially if they get the kind of instruction that we've learned and we'll discuss briefly here today, that is systematic, code-based, explicit, sequential. And then we have the focus of our conversation today, that 10 to 15% who can learn to read. The good news is, I want to reiterate that we do know that almost all these children can be taught to read. It depends a great deal on the how early we identify them and the amount and intensity of high quality instruction that they do receive. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. We do understand reading is a highly complex task. It involves interconnected and codependent processes that are all on the linguistic side of processes and draw upon a variety of separate skills. And this diagram, I think, represents that very well. What this is a representation of the outcomes of a multivariate study of reading, which this is a way that statisticians have been able to provide a map of, if you will, of how the brain is processing information and the outcomes of reading, and has statistically applied certain weights or values to each of these components. But the place to pay attention to, the components to pay attention to, are the end result. What we're talking about, all of these components, what we want at the end of the day is that a child, a reader, an adolescent, any reader can pick up a piece of text and comprehend it. And the two major contributors to that are language comprehension, comprised of all these interconnected pieces, and word identification. So it is a very complex process, as you can see. Many years ago, in 1986 to be specific, two researchers, Goff and Tunmer, created this a way to be talking about the complexity of reading, which they somewhat ironically labeled the simple view of reading. They took all that complexity and boiled it down to those essential pieces, that reading comprehension is the product of two major components, language comprehension, and they labeled decoding. So meaning that the components are the ability to understand spoken language and the ability to decode and recognize words. And we can apply that to that diagram I showed you. There's the outcome of all reading efforts that we hope for, reading comprehension, the product of language comprehension and decoding or word identification. So all they've done in the simple view essentially is hide all the other stuff, all the other components that contribute to these. There is some controversy sometimes. People say the simple view of reading, is that what science is all about? They think reading is simple. No, no one thinks reading is simple. They've simply given us the simple view, taken our attention to the very end of this process. And I'm sure some of you are aware of another major contribution to our clarity of understanding the complexity of reading, Hollis Scarborough's reading rope that many people refer to. It is one of your handouts today too. And simply what she's done is take those component pieces, she's broken them down a little bit more in this diagram, but she has the end result: skilled reading, fluent execution and coordination of word recognition and text comprehension, the RC from the simple view, comprised of the language comprehension. And then she breaks it down here into those components represented on that previous diagram, and the D, the word recognition. And our students with dyslexia, the focus of our conversation today, mostly have problems in this area. And that helps, that keeps them in many ways struggling with reaching that outcome of reading comprehension of grade level text. So the second section of our topic today, identifying and diagnosing students with dyslexia, always a very important part of the conversation because all of us as parents, teachers, researchers, we want to figure out who has dyslexia as quickly as possible. There is an understandable, urgent wish to diagnose dyslexia quickly and definitively. Unfortunately, we don't have such a measure. I have two chapters in Conquering Dyslexia related to diagnosis or identification of dyslexia. Chapter 2 is really for parents, the early telltale signs that we can start noticing as our children start to talk and engage in linguistic activities. And then chapter 3, where we get a little bit more technical around what happens more often in schools, screening and diagnosing dyslexia. When we talk the signs for parents to look for, is all about the early stages of linguistic development, those underlying building blocks of phonological and phonemic awareness. Phonological is the broader umbrella ability of the brain's ability to notice and identify and ultimately manipulate those units of oral language at the level of whole words and word parts. When we take it down to phonemic awareness, it's down to the sounds or phoneme levels in spoken words. So the research suggests that early on, we can encourage parents to take note of whether students are having difficulty pronouncing words, learning the alphabet is more of a struggle for them, or letter names. Hearing and producing rhymes is typically not easy for our children with dyslexia, or not possible at all. Whereas neurotypically developing children around 3 or 4 are going to start taking note of things like mommy and moon. Both have they may actually relate it to McDonald's, have that sound. Or retrieving words when speaking, getting stuck when they're trying to talk about something. But please do notice that word may have difficulty. May is capitalized there because dyslexia is unique. It manifests itself uniquely in every brain. Some students will not, some children will not have these difficulties and still have dyslexia. Some children will have these difficulties and not have dyslexia. Early on, there are patterns we can look for, but we have to be cautious about taking that all the way to a diagnosis. In the book, we talked about early screening being so important, and really the whole idea of that is making sure that we can get interventions going as quickly as possible. So a theme of my work, based on my interpretation of the research, is very clear that the focus we should be making around assessment should be focused on the intervention. The assessments should be, and the diagnosis, all of the work should be conducted so that we can, excuse me, get to the intervention as quickly as possible. So when we're talking about diagnostic assessments, if we keep in mind that it's all about getting us to intervention as quickly as possible, we're talking about these things: phonological awareness, word identification skills, phonics and decoding, ability to automatically recognize words, sight words, fluency, handwriting, spelling, language proficiency, listening comprehension. And some of these may be, if you're a reading specialist or have a reading background, this list will not be as of a surprise to you. And even if you're new to this conversation, you saw basically these most of these components represented before in the research studies, or these graphic representations of what we've understood from research. In your handouts, I included this dyslexia diagnostic checklist, which is in my book, Conquering Dyslexia, on page 92. This is my best understanding, representation of what the researchers are saying needs to be considered for a definition of dyslexia. As I started off this section, we all wish for the quick, definitive diagnostic test that we could give our students to say, yes, you have dyslexia, or no, you don't. And that test really doesn't exist. So what we're left with are looking at factors, and this can be done in a very formal way. I know when Cory and I have a chance to chat at the end, we're going to be talking about this more. Who is responsible for assessing and identifying, labeling and diagnosing dyslexia? Again, in my interpretation of the research, it's what's less important is the diagnosis. What is absolutely critical is the intervention. So I've really created this diagnostic checklist so parents can do this, so classroom teachers can do this. There are informal, good, scientifically based assessments that we can use for all of these kinds of things, or just our opinion about things, and see if there is, in fact, enough patterns for us to consider that, yes, a child may have dyslexia. So in the book, I created a scenario around a little girl named Emily, starting second grade, whose parents, they were just starting a new school. Parents reached out to the building reading specialist to say, we're worried about Emily. She didn't do very well with reading last year. We think she has dyslexia. So the scenario in the book, the classroom teacher did some interviews and observations and some informal assessments and made these determinations that Emily does have concerns around phonological phonemic awareness and that they're quite severe. She does have concerns around phonics and decoding that would be considered at beginning of second grade maybe moderate. She has concerns around sight words at a moderate level. Her reading fluency concerns at the beginning of second grade are severe. No problems with listening comprehension, some mild spelling issues, no concerns with handwriting or language. Parents did report that neither of them had been formally diagnosed with dyslexia, but had difficulties around reading, writing, spelling. And importantly, at the end, included appropriate instruction, because that is also one of the differentiators about whether a student, we can call or label or diagnose a student with dyslexia or not. We may have two children who have exactly the same profile of difficulty, but one may be caused by genetic heritable dyslexia. The other may be caused simply by lack of sufficient appropriate instruction. So we're not going to use the label dyslexia until we have determined that the child is struggling despite having received appropriate instruction and intervention. In the book, we also talk about when you do have some diagnostic results, whether done more informally or from one of the more formal sources, there are some things that should happen next once that diagnosis has been determined. The student should have a clear and understandable, age-appropriate, of course, explanation of their diagnosis. I know that this was very true for my daughter. It took us a while to get there. She struggled for quite a while before we really understood what was going on was what we would call dyslexia. And that was very important to her to talk about what's going on in her brain. It has nothing to do with her intelligence or lack of trying, that she has a brain that many other people do too, but it just makes those particular things difficult. The explanation, of course, would vary depending on the age of the child and other considerations. We also want to be sure, because dyslexia is a family concern, that the family gets the supports they need. Where can they get the support for their children? How can they get tutoring? How can they afford tutoring? Are they getting the services at the school that they should be getting? The emotional support that all families should be getting around dyslexia as well. And most important of all, this goes back to my idea that the most important thing is the intervention provided as early as possible. So we don't want to just diagnose and cry and hug each other, and we want to get on with the job of doing that intervention as early as possible. So that brings us to the last section that I have to discuss teaching our students with dyslexia. And to have that conversation, we return, to me, quite obviously, we return back to the research. And this time we're going to really pay attention to what has come from the research on this side of the equation, the psychology and educational side, how the brain functions, how a dyslexic brain functions differently than a neurotypical brain, and what we can do about it. And thankfully, we have decades now of research to guide our thinking about this. Returning again to the wonderful contributions of Mark Seidenberg, who says in his book, reminds us, he's certainly not the only person saying this, what we've learned about the brain is that reading is not learned the same way we learn to talk. There was a period of time in education where we were driven primarily by theories, and the prevailing theory that continues, elements of it, remnants of it continue today. Prevailing theory, which we now know is not true, is that reading is as natural as language. Half of that statement is true. Language is natural. We don't need to send our infants to language school to learn how to talk. Learning is supported neurologically and biologically in the brain. We believed for a long time that reading was too. It is not at all the same. It's linguistically interconnected with language, but it's not learned. Our brain doesn't learn it in the same way. Learning requires building new circuits, physically building new circuits in the brain that connect the language that we have, or we have to have. Reading is not going to happen for anyone if they don't have language, and that's hence the problem we have that many children who are deaf or hearing impaired have. They often have their own language. There's a rich language for the deaf community, but it's often not what's represented in print. So those are real big challenges to make. And if you remember Nancy Young's reading ladder, that some of our brains, some of the brains of the children that we work with, are wired in a way that makes this building of these new circuits relatively easy and quick. And others not so much at the bottom of that ladder. But in every case, new circuits do need to be built and formed, and primarily that's going to happen through instruction. When I was writing my book, I was finishing up some of the chapters in last August, and I took a break from writing one morning to read a blog from Dr. Pamela Snow, who's a researcher, reading researcher and scientist in Australia. She writes a regular blog, and I took a moment to read it, and it was so pertinent to what I was actually writing that day. And I included this quote in the book because I think it's so powerful. That early intervention is like building better fences at the top of the cliff rather than parking ambulances at the bottom. I remember just really sitting and thinking about that, how profound that is, and what a strong image that is, and how absolutely scientifically correct this is. Then she goes on to say in her blog that the very best early intervention is effective instruction. That's what is needed for most children, and certainly for our children with dyslexia. So back to Seidenberg again, who talks about the research on how children learn to read. And I think it's surprising, hard to interpret, I think, for many people, but he goes on to say that the answer is the same for all children. This is one of the amazing things we've learned about the brains, human brains, is that we all learn to read in the same way. Some are going to learn very easily. Some are going to learn at an expected rate. Some are going to learn only if we are diligent and persevering and very, very intentional about what we're doing. He does acknowledge, of course, that every single child born into the world is different. There are differences that are cultural, economic, educational, personality, all emotional, all kinds of things that will affect children's progress. But what they need to learn does not change. There's only one way that a brain becomes a reading brain. The pace, the ease is different, but the one way is this. All of these pieces need to be there. Absolutely clear, settled science. You can't learn to read without language comprehension. You can't learn to read without word recognition. And some of this is going to be very difficult for some of our children because of the way their brains work. So we also know more from the research about what that instruction actually looks like. And Buckingham and Castles, quoted again in my book, talking about the ethics of this and the prudent actions is all children should get the most effective reading methods. And we can go back to Nancy Young's ladder, where she incorporated this in her infographic here. She's talking about that a structured literacy approach is going to be essential for these children in the orange and the red to read proficiently or to learn to read at all for our children with dyslexia. But there's also research that says that if we take a structured literacy approach and apply it to the instruction of our children at the top of the ladder, that they do even better. They're going to learn to read essentially no matter what we give them, but their reading is going to be more advanced. There's going to be deeper. Their comprehension is going to be more. Their vocabulary, every aspect of their reading will be enhanced and advantaged by a structured literacy approach. And what we mean by structured literacy, we spend a significant number of pages in the book talking about that. The big component ideas are these. Structured literacy involves instruction that is reading instruction, that is comprehensive, systematic, explicit, intensive, and multimodality. Comprehensive meaning designed to cover both the foundational components of reading and advanced skills and knowledge, and that's so important. The conversation, you may all, or at least some of you, be aware that in the world, there continues to this day to be disagreement among reading practitioners, even reading researchers, so intense that sometimes that has been referred to as a reading war. And sometimes there are people on one side of the reading war that turn to researchers such as myself and say things like, all you think kids need is phonics. All you want to teach is phonics. If we just give kids lots of phonics, kids are learning to read. And of course, that's not true. Well, just that statement alone is not true. I have been involved in this kind of work for over 4 decades. I've done some of this research myself. I raised a child with dyslexia. I have never seen anywhere, I certainly have never seen a statement anywhere that phonics is the only thing or even the most important thing. It is one of the components that many of our children who struggle with learning to read struggle to learn. And it must be learned to a level of proficiency and automaticity for reading to be skillful. But that's not going to happen if we don't have the other component pieces in place. So a structured literacy is comprehensive. It is systematic, which means it's very carefully designed in how we use it. It's delivered effectively in an explicit way with clarity and intention. A gradual release of responsibility. You may have heard the terms I do, we do, you do, the explicit instruction, modeling, guided practice, and independent practice. That's part of structured literacy. Intensive instruction, that there's a focus, a purpose. Children are actively engaged. Very few children are going to learn to read, especially our struggling readers, if they simply receive lectures or talking to them or about reading. They need to get actively engaged with it. And active engagement leads us to the conversation of multimodality, that we do know that almost all of us as human beings learn best when we engage all our sensory modalities. The research, the most current research, is saying that this works the best when the sensory modalities are directly related to spelling and writing skill development, meaning that some of the modalities, what's often referred to as multisensory instruction, that was first developed and used with children with dyslexia in the 1920s and 30s, involved activities where the children were writing letters in the air to engage their kinesthetic senses, or they were tracing letters that were made of sandpaper, or writing letters in shaving cream or something on that order. That has not found to be all of actual value to students. What's more of value is having students write on a whiteboard, or write with a pencil in their hand, or write on a chalkboard, something of that order. Engaging all the senses, the seeing, the hearing, the talking, the motor, as long as they are directly related to the reading and writing task, is where the biggest payoff comes. And nowadays, at least for now, and maybe for a while longer, we're trying to do all of this virtually. And I wish I had the magic big ideas to make sure that we all could figure this out perfectly. But from my own experience over these last few months, as well as my understanding of effective instruction, my working with children who are finding learning to read difficult at any time, and especially so with this asynchronous or virtual instruction that we're doing. There are some big ideas that I want to at least touch on. And this idea is good instruction is good instruction. Just the fact that we're seeing our children only through a screen and talking to them through microphones doesn't change the fact that good instruction is good instruction. What we've learned about that structured literacy is true today. We have to acknowledge, of course, there are so many variables, from everything from just the strength of the internet connection that children have, the privacy that they have, the quality of the audio that they're receiving, whether they have attention issues. It just goes on and on and on, which is completely understandable. And we acknowledge that all of us are more stressed, that this pandemic that we're going through has created levels of trauma from at least mild for all of us to quite profound and severe for some families. And we can't ignore that either. And that's certainly going to impact our challenged learners, including our children with dyslexia. We have to have some conversations around how much new learning can we actually expect versus holding on to the learning that we've achieved previously. We could have at least hours of conversation just around this topic, but I wanted to, it would be silly to try to ignore that right now. But for the remainder of our time, first I want to thank you very much for participating today. For those of you who are joining us later on the recorded version of this, thank you so much. On my handouts and here on this last slide, I have my email address, janhasbrouck@gmail.com, and my Twitter handle, where I don't know if any of you are active on Twitter. I wasn't for a long time because I was very concerned about what I had heard about Twitter being a place where all this angry politicians talked about each other, or there's just a lot of celebrity news. But what I found is that if you're on Twitter and narrowly focus yourself, which I have done, my Twitter conversations are entirely around reading, and I have found it to be a wonderful way to connect with fellow researchers, colleagues, parents, and educators. So I'd love to continue this conversation with you on Twitter. But for now, I'm going to ask Cory to join back in, and we're going to spend a few minutes doing a little bit of deeper dive around some of the questions that some of you submitted, a lot of you submitted actually. So Cory, I'll turn it back to you now.
Great, thank you, Jan. That was such a great, clear, concise presentation of what we know about a pretty complex topic. As we transition into the conversation portion of our webinar, I want to start by thanking all of you participating today or who registered to listen to this in a recording, who submitted hundreds of questions. We're going to try to address as many of the hot topics and common themes as we can in the 25 minutes or so that we have remaining. But Jen and I both appreciate the earnest and pressing questions and needs that have been expressed and wish we had the time to address them all. To those ends, I want to highlight just a few takeaway resources that will be linked within the follow-up email to this webinar. First, in Jan's book, Conquering Dyslexia, she discusses in detail screening and diagnostic assessment in Chapter 3. She unpacks structured literacy and multi-tiered systems of support in Chapter 4, and what content needs to be taught in Chapter 5. And so she provided a nice summary of some of the high points of those things, but for more information and a deeper dive, that's a great resource for you to continue your learning journey on that. A second resource for extended learning is Read Naturally's new white paper on dyslexia. This extensive paper presents the topic in 4 sections. First, answering the questions, what is dyslexia? How do proficient readers read words? And how does dyslexia affect typical reading? And then the final section explicitly addresses how Read Naturally programs can be used to meet those needs, which programs are designed to meet which needs, and specific features that supports learners with dyslexia so that you can build your understanding of how the programs are designed to support all students and explicitly students with dyslexia. And so for those that submitted specific Read Live questions, for example, that'll be a great resource for you to follow up on those ideas. And finally, towards the back of Janet's book on pages 160 to 162 and Appendix A of the white paper, you will find lists of additional resources and readings from organizations to individual readings to books where you can learn more about dyslexia and the science of reading. And so as we carry on from this webinar today, just a few resources for you to get a deeper dive. So with that, Jen, let's chat. There are a lot of myths and confusion around dyslexia, and you discussed quite a few of them, but I think it would be nice for us to start our conversation addressing some participant questions around that first foundational question of what is dyslexia and what is it not? And so let me shoot a few participant questions here at you and give you a chance to respond to a few of those. Some of them were around really prognosis. And so a couple of examples of that might be, does one grow out of dyslexia? And can one acquire dyslexia later in life, or is it merely undiagnosed from childhood?
Very good questions, and ones that I have posed similar questions to some of my research colleagues around that, especially in that notion. Well, first of all, specifically to those questions, do you outgrow dyslexia? No, you don't outgrow dyslexia. But what can happen is with very early identification and, of course, intervention, which is the whole reason we worry or are concerned about diagnosis specifically. The brain can be rewired to the point where it nearly mirrors the brain of a person born with a neurotypical brain. And honestly, we don't have enough longitudinal data to be tracking that in a very systematic way, because all of our conversations about rewiring the brain, the evidence behind that is about 2 decades long. So that is a question that will be answered more in the future. But we can watch the behaviors of people who were diagnosed early. And what we find, and of course, remembering that dyslexia is a spectrum disorder. So some of our dyslexic readers are affected in a very mild way. But if we have noticeable dyslexia that is intervened, and we have intervened early with powerful structured literacy instruction, those brains can eventually appear to be nearly neurotypical. What seems to be the toughest nut to crack is fluency. That dyslexic brains, even with superb early intervention, rarely reach the point of fluent, effortless reading retrieval of print that their neurotypical peers, even with the best instruction. That's a very general statement. Every statement about dyslexia has to be stated that it's general, because everybody's a unique individual. The second part of that question, can you develop dyslexia later in life? No, it has been likely it was undetected, or the difficulties with reading, writing, and spelling can be caused by things other than the neurobiological genetic issue of dyslexia. If someone were in, for instance, many years ago, I tutored an adult who had been a reasonably proficient reader, but then was in a serious car accident and had brain trauma. And his brain trauma as an adult mirrored what we would consider dyslexia. Instructionally, pretty much the same issue. We respond the same way, but he didn't develop neurobiological dyslexia. He developed difficulty learning. His accident caused reading and writing and spelling to be difficult for him as an adult. Do you have thoughts on that too, Cory? I know that you've done so much work on dyslexia. I want you to add your thoughts or opinions on my responses too.
Sure, absolutely. So the white paper unpacks a little bit the difference between acquired dyslexia, which is a neurotypical brain, a person who has become literate that then has their reading network damaged or impaired, whether that's through traumatic brain injury or stroke or some other damage to the neural network. And so while the symptoms are very similar whenever the network itself is disrupted, of course, the cause of that is very different from developmental dyslexia, which is the cause of which is caused by abnormal brain development during pregnancy and early infancy. So, yeah. So another question that we have here is, what do we tell parents when they say, I have dyslexia and I think my child has it too? And the core of this is kind of that genetic familial link. What should participants know about that, Jen?
Yeah. Yes, and I've had that conversation with parents over the years. In fact, I was part of an MTSS virtual, of course, meeting yesterday at the school where I volunteer, and we were meeting with the first grade team. And one of the teachers said that she had a one-on-one meeting with one of the parents who said exactly that. I think my husband and I both have dyslexia, and we're thinking our student does too. So our child. The first thing I would probably say to a parent is I would ask them why they think that. Were they formally diagnosed with dyslexia? How was that diagnosis conducted? Because that's important too. What kind of interventions did they receive? How is reading and writing for them these days? And very importantly, why do you suspect this might be true of your child? What signs and symptoms are you seeing? And then if it seems like in rare cases, I may, and I think it's probably good news, I would talk to the parents and say, I think that what I'm hearing you talk about is probably not dyslexia, but of course, we will look carefully into the concerns you have with your child. Or if it does appear to be dyslexia, we then have to talk about next steps to take in terms of diagnosis. And I think we're probably going to get into that about the formal aspects of diagnosis, but that will vary depending on the age of the child, the state in which the child lives, the district policies around dyslexia, all of which would affect my recommendations about next steps to take.
Great. Yeah, the heredity research has shown that children of a parent who is dyslexic have a 30 to 50% chance that they may have dyslexia, and that if a student has a sibling with dyslexia, that a student with dyslexia, approximately half of their siblings will likely have it as well. So family risk in doing conversations with parents, with families about, is there anyone else in the family that you know of that has struggled with reading, is one of those important risk factors in conversations in engaging family. That can certainly be one of the many risk factors that you take a look at that may indicate that might be a source of things. In terms of that diagnosis, you beautifully covered many symptoms and characteristics of dyslexia. There were lots of questions on assessment and diagnosis, as identification of dyslexia is probably the area that's most confusing for folks in the field at the moment and underlies lots of the greatest challenges facing systems today. So let's address a few of those submitted questions to clear up some of that. Many of them are wrapped up into this big question for you. Is dyslexia an educational classification, a physical medically identified condition, or a clinical psychological diagnosis, or some combination of those?
Yes, the flip answer would be yes to all of those things. There's so much that has been what we would consider settled science, if we want to use that term, around dyslexia, but we certainly have more to learn. And I think in part because of the nature of dyslexia, how intensely emotional the impact of dyslexia is on an individual and their family. There's a lot of feelings and beliefs around dyslexia, and it's really hard to sort all those things out. There are strong beliefs that dyslexia, we know it to be a neurobiological concern. We also have understood from the Sam Orton's and Gillingham's work in the 20s and 30s that the intervention is always educational. So that puts dyslexia both in the medical and the educational camp. There are some physicians who in their training, especially pediatricians, have some level of training and information about dyslexia, but just recently on Twitter, Dr. Nadine Gaab, who is taking advantage of the fact that this month, October, has been identified as Dyslexia Awareness Month, and she is a world leading researcher in dyslexia. She's posting myths on dyslexia, one each day in the month of October. And one day this month, she's talked about the fact that most pediatricians, in fact, aren't trained in dyslexia. They are trained to look at all kinds of developmental issues, but very few know about dyslexia or have the ability to screen or diagnose. And very few pediatricians would diagnose it. They would send you to a clinical cognitive psychologist, someone in the field who does that kind of work. However, those diagnoses, once you can get them, vary in quality as well. There are people with belief systems in that field who are charging often a lot of money, hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of dollars, to conduct those evaluations. Sometimes are many, many hours in length, sometimes happening over a couple of settings. And at the end of the day, what we've got, or what we really need to respond clinically, is a list of, do they have strong phonological awareness or not? Do they have strongly developed phonic skills or not? How is their language developed? It's less these cognitive profiles than a skill representation. And I was looking over my book this morning, and just my philosophy around this has certainly been developed in part because I approached this first as a reading practitioner. And I really believe that much of the work around diagnosis should be in our hands. And on page 19 of my book, I talk about this. I quote two researchers who suggest that we should, of course, identify individuals with reading-related problems as early as possible, then monitor their response to high-quality, evidence-based intervention. That's the end of their quote. And I go on to say, then a diagnostic label is unnecessary and a, quote, wait to fail, unquote, scenario is avoided. It's really all about early intervention. Now the problem, Cory, and you know this well, is that getting services in schools sometimes is dependent on a diagnosis, a formal diagnosis. Some school districts only provide services to children with dyslexia through special education. Other states and districts have a whole separate way of serving children with dyslexia outside of special education. So we don't have enough guidance, we don't have enough settled science to say this is how it's done, and then this is how it should be responded to in a school. My personal preference is a quick, relatively informal diagnosis of skills. Whether or not the child has dyslexia, remember the structured literacy works with all children. Some are going to just need it more intensively than others. Let's get started with the instructions quickly as we possibly can.
Right. So if I could just add to that a little bit, you know, all of those avenues, whether through medical professionals, clinical professionals, or educational professionals, as well as families themselves and parents, all of those individuals can identify the risk factors and signs of dyslexia, which, as you said so importantly, ultimately is remediated through educational response. The response happens in schools. And so I know many parents have heard from educators, and many educators, I think, may have the false impression that schools can't, quote, diagnose dyslexia. Well, that diagnosis is not per se a medical issue. Sally Shaywitz, in her latest update of her book, cautions that brain scans is not going to be the ultimate end all of diagnosis, because this is complex. It's on a scale that has to do with impact and the diagnosis itself, and what we do with it varies from individual to individual. But I want to highlight two important things. Number one, that the U.S. Department of Education put out a letter a number of years ago clarifying that schools can use the word dyslexia, and that a specific learning disability in reading, you can call it that. And so educators don't need to avoid the word. We had a question in live chat here, specifically about the intersection of dyslexia and other conditions. Mary's question was about ADHD. There's another about, can it be masked by some other issues? And so I wonder if a next stepping point might be any thoughts that you have on the fact that dyslexia can co-occur with other issues, and how might educators approach that or think about that?
Yes, that's very true, and that has been documented by both the medical and the educational side of research, that there are often coexisting conditions. A frequent one is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. More specifically, attention deficit disorder is a commonly co-occurring condition of our children with dyslexia. How we respond to that instructionally is pulling out all the tricks in our toolkit, the tools in our toolkit to address attention deficit concerns. How we structure the instruction, the frequency and intensity of the instruction. None of that changes, but those children's difficulties with attention is just going to make that provision of the structured literacy even that much more challenging. It takes even a bigger team of folks working with children like that to design and deliver the appropriate instruction. Often for those kids, especially in the early years, which are so important, getting started at preschool if possible, kindergarten and first grade, where attention for the most on track neurotypical child, their attention span is so small. Really finding ways to break the instruction up into really tiny little bits that we repeat frequently, and that's where we often bring in our parent partners, so we can do a little bit of these practices as many of the waking hours as we possibly can to address that issue. Another frequently, and this was really more new news to me as I was writing the book, looking into the co-occurring concerns around language development, which is not part of the symptoms of dyslexia. It is a separate condition, but we do have language development disorders in some of our children. Some researchers are saying it may be up to 70% of our children with dyslexia, but it is separate. A separate diagnosis, a separate condition, but often co-occurring. And then, especially for those children, and again, especially if it's severe, we want to expand our team a little bit more, certainly bring in our speech language pathologist partners, and be working on language development for those children. Similar kind of approach if we're talking about not a disorder at all, of course, but our children who are learning English as a second language and having dyslexia. There are some wonderful resources. I'm a big fan of Elena Cardenas-Hagen's work, who specializes in children with language and learning disorders who are second language learners. There's a growing body of evidence about the resources we can do. So we're layering on for all of those children when we have multiple co-occurring disorders or learning challenges.
So as I'm reading by the right hand as it is, or looking at the clock, this should be fun. Let's see if we can't do a bit of a rapid fire round. I'm going to shoot some questions at you, and let's see. Obviously, you can take the time you need, but if we can shoot some sort of the 30-second answers, the elevator responses here, let's see how many we can get through in the time that we have.
Okay, good, Cory. That's a good challenge for me.
In terms of additional hot topics, we had a few questions about. You addressed multisensory, multimodal in the presentation, but other hot topics. And so starting with, do colored overlays, specialized reading glasses, specialized fonts, or other external supports assist learners with dyslexia with their reading?
The quickest answer is no, the science is not there. As painful as that may be, because we're looking always for those quicker answers, but the science, and there has been some good studies on those Irlen lens or colored overlays, no effect in any kind of scientific study, or for dyslexia fonts, that there are people creating those, selling those, promoting those, making money off of those. There's no scientific evidence that those work. Everything that we can come up with may work and may advantage an individual child. And so we can't discount. If it works for your child, then you should be using it. But we do need to look at the science for recommendations. There's no science to colored lenses. There's no science to dyslexia fonts.
Great. Is the 3-cueing system for early reading instruction good or bad? And how do teachers support students to stop guessing at words?
Yeah, okay, you've given me the choice of saying good or bad. I think the science emerging around 3-cueing system is definitely saying it is not effective. We can look at many sources of evidence for that. It is the most widely used to this day instructional technique being used in schools, and in our schools in the United States of America, only about 33% of our fourth graders are proficient readers. So something that we're doing is not working, because according to Nancy Young's research and her ladder, about 40% of our children should be good readers no matter what we do. So we're not even up to there. The evidence around 3-cueing is that it is detrimental. It is not helpful, and it is detrimental to many children. And once they have learned to guess, that is an ongoing conversation in all reading social media. It is a very hard habit to break. So the best answer to that is prevention, not using the 3-cueing system for reading instruction.
Thank you. We had a lot of questions prior to our discussion today about multilingual learners, and there's one live from Ken as well. For bilingual children who are experiencing language transition and therefore have lower oral language skills, perhaps in English and their native languages, can they have dyslexia? And I know it's rapid fire, but are there specific things that educators and multilingual learners you would highlight today in a quick fire?
Well, the quickest answer I can give would be to get a copy of a new book, published 2020, Literacy Foundations for English Learners. Elsa, I missaid her name earlier, Elsa Cardenas-Hagen, who is a specialist. She is very active in the International Dyslexia Association and revered for her work around children who are learning English. So yes, of course it can happen. Dyslexia happens at the same propensity, the same essential rate in any language, whether a student is learning one language or multiple languages. It doesn't matter how transparent the languages are, easy to learn, unlike English, which is not easy to learn. It is not transparent. We have the same proportion of children who are, or adult readers who are dyslexic. But Elsa Cardenas-Hagen's work is where I would go. A friend and a colleague who this is her life's work, and she has the best answer. So I would run to get a copy of her 2020 book, Literacy Foundations for English Learners, and wish you good luck and your students good luck.
Terrific. All right, so many good questions. I'm going to boil down to our last two here. Many folks asking specifically for support in specific classroom strategies, instructional moves. Where would you recommend folks go for specific instructional pieces for how do you teach students these specific things? Do you have a go-to for that?
A rather flip answer would be go to the Read Naturally website. My good friends and colleagues at Read Naturally have done such fabulous work creating tools. They're probably best known for their tool on helping children achieve reading fluency, the Read Naturally strategy that's now embedded in the Read Live materials. But the readnaturally.com is a place I send my colleagues all the time for wonderful, field-tested, effective, research-based tools around phonemic awareness development, vocabulary development, deepening phonics skills, and of course the gold standard for fluency instruction. And that's sincere, not just that these people have been my friends and colleagues for a very long time, and they are sponsoring our workshop today. It's rare for me, honestly, to go through a day where I'm not sending a parent or a teacher colleague to the Read Naturally website. That's an easy place to start. The second, I guess, Cory, would be that list of resources that I have, including go back to the International Dyslexia Association. They are there for educators and parents. That's why they exist, and they have a wealth of information. And another, quickly, the Reading Rockets website, which is also updated frequently. They try to keep in touch with current science. It is a website built for parents, but many educators find it very useful as well to support learning challenges around reading.
Great. I'll just mention that under the research tab, if you go to our website, there's an alignments with best practices page, which links to several practice guides from the Institute of Education Sciences and elsewhere that are also good sources of summaries of what literacy panels have found to be recommendations for effective practices that are research-based, and they provide some specific classroom activities that will be useful there as well. We are in the process right now of posting a new one related to a Barbara Foreman chaired panel on foundational reading skills for K through 3. We have a lot of people today asking in terms of developmentally about middle school, high school. We have adult basic education workers and those that work with adults, correctional facilities. And so the last question I'm going to pose as we go just a minute over is, are there any differences in the response to older students than that for younger students, or any recommendations you would make for those educators on our webinar today that work with older students?
Yes, and the first thing I would say to those of you who work with our older students and adults, thank you, and bless you for the work that you're doing. You know how important it has, and you know certainly that deep and scarring emotional impact of dyslexia when we don't address it in the early grades, and our students do get to middle school, high school, end up in correctional facilities and beyond, still struggling with reading, which is preventable. It is just heartbreaking. I do hold completely to the research, Sally Shaywitz's research and others who say it is never too late. Admittedly, it is much, much, much harder for a whole lot of reasons. But we address the same things. These adolescents or adults are struggling to learn because their brain has not been sufficiently wired to connect their language to print in most cases. So many of those people have deficits and gaps in their phonemic awareness, and that needs to be addressed in a I'm getting a bad echo now here, in an age-appropriate way, of course. But again, I would turn to a lot of the tools on the Read Naturally website and I have successfully used those with adolescent readers and readers in a correctional facility as well. So it can be very supportive.
Great. Thank you, Jan, for spending the last hour and a half or so with us today. And thanks to everyone for attending our webinar. Another reminder that we'll be sending out follow-up emails with links to the recording and other resources within the next day. So please look for that in your inbox. You can find other previously recorded webinars as well as those we have upcoming on our website at readnaturally.com/webinars. I invite you to consider joining my colleague, Ben Weisner, next week for the webinar entitled Read Live School to Home Connections, where you will learn about features within Read Live available to support family engagement and distance learning. And finally, if you could, please respond to the survey that will appear on your screen as you exit the webinar. This helps us in our efforts to improve these educational experiences for all of you in the future. Thanks again. And Jan, any final comment you'd like before we sign off today?
No, just thanks to everybody again, and those of you who work with our children with dyslexia, our adolescents and adults, thank you so much. As a parent, as a colleague, thank you so much for your work, and hang in there.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you again, Jan. Thanks to all of you, and we wish you all a wonderful day.